Hi, good evening everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. Oh, sorry, we'll try to minimise how much that happens. So, are we all sitting comfortably? Good. Right, thank you for coming down. Great to see so many familiar faces. We've got a lot of our existing clients in the room, and thank you to all the new faces, people we don't know here. As Matt was saying, there's been a lot of changes in the legislation in the lettings world, which is really, both there's financial penalties for not getting it right, but also penalties in terms of how that impacts you getting possession of your property back. So we wanted to bring you this event, cover some of this legislation in the hope that we can make sure we're all getting it right and we're not going to have any problems running your portfolios. So some of you might have heard of some of this stuff we're going to talk about tonight. Some of you might have heard of it but not know the full intricacies of it, and some of you might not have heard any of it at all. So what I'm hoping is there's going to be something for all of you, and hopefully we can give you some value tonight as we talk about stuff. Okay, so a lot of this legislation, as I say, came into play actually in 2015, so it's not new stuff. So that's why I'm saying some of you may have actually heard about it before, but there are, as I say, some sort of intricacies and some small wording in some of this legislation which makes it that little bit more complicated. So what I'm going to be covering is the deposit regulations, how to properly protect deposits, the smoke alarm regulations and carbon monoxide regulations, just so you can cover yourself on that. We've got this horrible thing called the Deregulation Act, which has come out, which is quite a complicated piece of legislation, but this is the one that really impacts whether you can serve a Section 21 notice. Hopefully everybody knows what that is, but that's the notice you have to serve if you want to get possession of your property back. We're also going to cover right to rent. We're now acting as immigration officers for the government, and we have to make sure that the tenants have actually got the proper immigration status, so we're going to cover that as well. And as I say, there's kind of heavy penalties, both financially and in terms of whether you can recover the possession of your property. So really what I'm saying is what you do at the start of your tenancy might not actually really affect you right now. But if you don't get it right, further down the line when you're looking to serve your Section 21s and get your property back, that's when it is going to cause you some issues. So let's have a look at each one in more detail and see how up to date everybody is. So the deposit regulations, again this has been in place for a long time now. We've had to, any tenancy which is on an assured short-hold tenancy has needed the deposit to be protected since 2007. But essentially, it's pretty simple. When you take a deposit from a tenant, it needs to be protected within 30 days of you receiving it. That's going to be with one of 3 government schemes. There's only 3 approved schemes. That's the DPS, the Deposit Protection Service, the Tenancy Deposit Service, the TDS, or My Deposits. Now, there's 2 ways you can do this. One is called a custodial scheme, where you take the money and you actually pay it away to the scheme and they will hold the money. The second is an insured scheme, whereby you hold the money. You can't just stick it in your back pocket these days and keep it there. It has to be properly protected, and but you insure it with either the TDS or My Deposits. Doing that alone is not enough though. As well as protecting it within the 30 days, we also have to serve a document called the prescribed information on the tenants. Basically, this is a document which says what the amount of the deposit, who is the landlord, who is the tenant, and where you are protecting this deposit. So simply taking the deposit and doing the first bit is not enough. We have to give them this prescribed information document, and more importantly, as you'll see as we go throughout this talk, we have to be able to prove that we've given these tenants all these documents. So that's 2 things we've had to do so far on a deposit, but that's still not enough. We also have to give them the terms and conditions that go along with that scheme. So essentially there's 3 elements. We have to put it with a scheme and protect it and register it. We have to give them the prescribed information, and we also need to give them the terms and conditions. Now importantly, if we don't comply with that, there's two things that can go wrong. One is you can be fined up to 3 times the value of that deposit. Now, bearing in mind, as a standard for our agency, we take a 1.5 months the rent as a deposit. you know, that can be a lot of money. We're talking thousands of pounds here as a fine if you don't protect it properly. More than that though, and you're going to see a theme as we go throughout my talk, is that if you don't comply with this, you can't serve the Section 21. So if you haven't properly protected deposit at the start of the tenancy, when you then come to want possession of your property back, you're going to have problems serving your Section 21. Serving a Section 21, we have to give a minimum of 2 months' notice to the tenant. So you may have done that, be 2 months down the line going for possession of your property, and the court won't even look at it because you haven't complied, therefore your Section 21 won't be valid. So really important to make sure we're actually properly protecting deposits and serving the correct documentation that goes along with them. Okay, so moving on to the smoke alarms and the CO2 alarms. This is a lot more simple. Essentially, you must now have a smoke alarm on every level of the property. So if it's a 2-storey house, we must have one in the hallway, one on the landing. Obviously a 3-storey townhouse, one on every floor, but it's really important, not just one in the property, there has to be one on every level. The interesting thing, and this is where people might fall slightly foul, is you have to be able to prove that they were working on the first day of the tenancy. So great that you've gone and got your smoke alarm, you've put it in a week before your tenant moves in, but should something go wrong and you can't prove that you had it working on the first day of the tenancy, then that is where you come into kind of hot water. So you need a system in place. Generally we will, at the point of check-in, our inventory clerks will be checking them, and when we check a tenant in, we'll also be checking it and then documenting that and getting them to sign for it. But important that you have that in place. The other thing I just wanted to mention was the carbon monoxide alarms. The reason I mention this is it's not actually legislation that you have to have one. I think it's something we recommend to all our landlords, and I think it would be a lot more straightforward if the law was that you have to have one. However, you actually only need one in rooms with a solid fuel appliance, so things like wood burners, coal burners, etc. But as I say, I think for the sake of £20, it's well worth having a carbon monoxide if you've got a boiler there, just to cover yourself. But to answer the many questions I get about it, you don't have to have one unless you've got a solid fuel appliance. Okay, so let's talk about the Deregulation Act. Basically what the pieces of this legislation that we need to know as landlords are that there's 5 things that we must give to the tenants at the start of the tenancy. And again, we must be able to prove that we've given it, and that's really the thing that I want to get across to everybody throughout this speech is there's got to be, you've got to have systems in place to prove that you've given this stuff to the tenants. So the first thing is a copy of the How to Rent Guide, which is a government document. You can download it from the government website. Important thing is you must make sure it's the current edition, as the government like to do. Every now and then they will update these things. So you must be able to prove that you've given the tenants a How to Rent Guide. Second thing, if it's applicable, is a gas safety certificate, an energy performance certificate, which you must have to be able to sell or rent any property in England and Wales anyway. So you should have that before you've even rented it out or before you've even started marketing it. But again, we must be able to prove we've given that to them. Must be able to prove we've given a copy of the prescribed information. Again, we already know about the deposit regulations, so that should have been done as part of that. But that's another thing that we must be able to show. And the fifth thing is, if it's applicable, any licences that you require for the property. So round here we don't have any mandatory licensing for rental properties. Some areas of the country the local authority will make you have a licence for any rental property. We're lucky pretty much I think across the whole of Essex where we manage properties we don't have to have that. Of course if you've got an HMO, a licensable HMO, then you'd need to be able to prove that you've given them a copy of that as well. So again, really the important part about this is issuing your Section 21. So you'll see we're always coming back to that point in that if you haven't complied with this at the start of the tenancy, you might serve your Section 21, again, go for possession of the property, you'll be going to court, and then suddenly you didn't give the tenant a copy the How to Rent guide. Again, if you haven't complied with all parts of this, if you haven't given them all 5 things, you won't be able to do that. And the important thing is you need to be able to prove it. So the way we do that is that when we issue their tenancy agreement, we're also issuing these documents alongside that, and they're signing for them right at the start of the tenancy, and we know they've had them right from the off. But it's really important because, as I say, if you imagine you have a problem tenant, you need to remove them from the property, and you go all that way, you've served them your Section 21, you get 2 months down the line, and it all falls apart just because you didn't give them a government document. Okay, so if anybody's got any questions on that, come and see me afterwards, but we've really got to sort of get that right. The other thing I've put here is retaliatory eviction, so that comes under the Deregulation Act. So tenants can now complain that we're trying to evict them as a retaliatory eviction because they've reported some maintenance. So it's now really important that we handle maintenance complaints in an auditable way, really, and that we document everything we're doing in relation to that. We can't just tell tenants bugger off, basically. We have to make sure we're doing it properly. So the way the legislation reads here is that we must give an adequate response to complaints of maintenance within 14 days, and you must be able to prove how you've done that, because if the tenant then decides, oh, well, I'm not happy with that response, and they report you to the local authority. If the local authority comes along and has a look and says, yeah, okay, actually, you've got a damp and mould problem there, and we actually do believe it's the landlord's problem, they can issue you what's called a relevant notice. And that will be a notice requiring you to then actually do those works and put this right. Once you've got one of those relevant notices in place, you cannot serve your Section 21 for 6 months. So again, that's causing you a big kind of problem. If you want the property back, you won't be able to get it back. You won't even be able to serve the Section 21 for 6 months. So we have an online reporting system which allows tenants to report maintenance through their mobile, their tablet, anything like that. And importantly, it creates an audit trail, so we can see when they reported the maintenance and exactly what we've done about it all the way along. But I'd suggest if you're managing your own properties, really you need to start documenting everything. Have conversations via email, obviously, to develop rapport and deal with your tenants, you need to be speaking to them. But I would want to, you really want to start getting everything confirmed in writing and getting everything documented, because if somebody does turn on you and says, well, actually I've had no response, and reports you to the local authority, you need to be able to show the actions you have been taking in order to cover yourself. So, as I said, the consequences really of all this stuff with the Deregulation Act is that there's heavy fines for non-compliance within some of it, and importantly, this Section 21 thing is a problem. You need to be able to make sure you've got all your ducks in a row, and make sure all your admin is really watertight from the start, so that you don't come unstuck later down the line. The other thing just to quickly cover is this right to rent. So we're now kind of acting as immigration officers for the government, and we now have to check the immigration status of tenants. That's both at the start, but you've also got a responsibility to make sure you're continuing to check that down the line. So if somebody's got a visa that's going to expire, it's no good just checking it at the start of the tenancy. You can't have them living in your property with an expired visa. So you're going to have a system in place to make sure, as well as your gas safety certificates, as well as your energy performance certificates and everything, you need to make sure you're constantly checking that along the way. You need to keep a record of the checks as well, so you need to be able to prove that you have made that check, because if it turns out that they've given you a fake document and it turns out they actually haven't got the correct immigration status, therefore they haven't got the right to rent, unless you can prove and document the checks that you did make, again there's heavy fines for non-compliance with that. So pretty easy, get a copy of their passport, driving licence and proof of address, any visa documents, any identity cards for European residents, etc. Take a copy of that and certify it yourself to say that you've seen the original and you're happy that that person matches it. That will cover you, but you do need to have a record that you've made that check. So I hope that's been useful. As I say, it's happy to have a chat with people further on each of these things, but I think most of you have probably heard of a lot of this legislation, but as I say, there's some real kind of intricacy and intricate wording in some of it that, you know, having to check that the smoke alarm works on the very first day of the tenancy, a lot of people might not have known that. The documentation you've got to serve to go along with deposits to actually make sure you've fully protected your deposit. Again, it's really important to have all this kind of stuff in place. So just to summarise, make sure you protect your deposits first of all. Don't not protect them. Make sure you place them with one of the government schemes. Issue the correct documentation, so that's the prescribed information and also the terms and conditions that go along with that particular scheme. Make sure you can prove that your fire alarms, your smoke alarms are working on the first day of the tenancy. If you do happen to have any properties with solid fuel appliances, then you're going to need to make sure that you've got a CO2 alarm there as well. And ensure your tenants have got the right to rent, so make sure you are checking those immigration statuses. But the important thing for me is just evidence everything. Make sure you're keeping records of everything, or make sure any agent you're using has got the systems in place and they're obviously doing that for you. And you know, just always having kind of the back of your mind, the Section 21, can I issue it? Have I done everything I need to be able to recover possession of my property should I need to? Okay, well, thank you. I hope that's given you some kind of snippets of information. Even if you had heard of some of this stuff, I hope that's given you a little bit of information and make you think at least about how you can stay compliant and anything that you might need to do more. If you haven't got any of this stuff in place that we've spoken about, get it in place now is what I would say. Don't wait further down the line until you do want to start getting your properties back for any reason. If you haven't registered a deposit, get it registered now. If you haven't got an energy performance certificate or a gas certificate, or if you haven't evidenced that you've given them to your tenants, just revisit it now. Make sure it's all documented and just get it done really, because it could hit you in the pocket and it could also give you the further consequence of not being able to recover the property. All right, so thank you very much for listening, and I think we're going to take a short break now and have some food shortly. So I will leave you with that, and then I think the main event, probably what you've all come to listen, we're going to have John coming on later from Pocknells to talk to you about tax and how you can be tax efficient. So thank you very much.